This is Peter's third example, and it's actually a third difficult life circumstance where his overall message in all three examples is, you are being watched. You are being watched, so live for Jesus in this difficult situation. If you remember from before, when we were looking at them, we were looking at how Peter was saying, you are being watched by the people around you, therefore you should obey even evil emperors. You are being watched, so therefore you should obey even evil employers. Today's passage has got a lot to say that cuts across a lot of our culture today. It's easy for us to just read the words and react to them, maybe get confused by them, not like them, upset by them, mixed up by them, confused by them. We need to remember what 1 Peter 2 verse 12 says. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honourable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So as I said, the previous examples were about how to behave in front of an evil emperor. When it's an evil emperor or ruler that's making the rules, setting the agenda for your nation, for your life, and you're meant to be living as a foreigner, a pilgrim, you've got a new heavenly home, you're not really part of this land, but Peter says, still obey the laws of the land. The second example was where an unfair master or employer is making the rules that affect your working life, setting the agenda for your working hours. And then in this third example, we have the marriage relationship, and in particular, the situation primarily of a wife, and then he addresses a husband later on. So a lot of what I've got to say today will be on the subject of husbands and wives, but if you are not married, either because you've never been married, or because your husband or wife has passed away, or because you're divorced, or whatever the reason is, please don't switch off, because there is a lot that you can apply to your life as well. Obviously, within context, Peter's mainly addressing husbands and wives, but it's not only for husbands and wives, because there's other messages that we can all learn from it. If you remember, I think it was last time I was preaching, I said that Peter always is looking at the person that's the most likely to suffer in the relationship, the powerless, I think was the phrase I used, and how in that powerless situation, what is the person meant to do? So the person powerless, the laws of the land like this, there's this evil emperor, what can I do? So Peter instructs. He's how to handle the difficult situation of an evil emperor, an evil employer, an unbelieving husband, or an evil husband is the third category. Peter goes on to say to the wife, you are being watched. Let your good and pure conduct win your husband for Christ. I have a few quick questions for you. Which is more special to God? Who is more important? Who is more valued? A Christian or a member of Parliament? A Christian or whoever's the king or queen at the time? Who's more important to God? Who's more special? A Christian or the Emperor Nero? A Christian employee or a Sikh boss? Who's more significant? Who has more value? Who is more important? Who is more special to God? Jesus, the high priest, Pontius Pilate. In all of these examples that I've put up there for you, I think we would come to one of two conclusions. Either we would say they're all equally important to God. And if we were going to pick one row, one column, some of you might be thinking, well, maybe the left one because they're Christians. Who is more important or more worthwhile to God? It's interesting because these are all covered by Peter's examples. And the left list were all told to submit to the right list. They were all told, or we were given the example, if you think of Jesus, Jesus submitted to the high priest, to the Romans, to Pontius Pilate, to the unjust judge. And it wasn't about him being worth less. It was a choice that he made for a greater purpose. And with all those other examples that Peter makes, it's a choice that someone makes, not because they are worth less, but for a greater purpose. Wife, husband. You see, submission in the Bible is not about importance or worth or value. It's got nothing to do with that. It's simply about God saying there is a purpose behind why I'm saying to do this. It's in these examples, it's not because the people on the left or the people on the right are more important, more spiritual, always get it right. Look at that list on the right. Far from it in Peter's example. But there is a greater purpose. And we know that in Christian marriages, obviously I said this was talking about, Peter's particularly addressing the issue of a wife with a non-Christian husband, and one who doesn't obey the word. But we also see that in Christian marriages, the person on the right, the husband, the list from the people on that right-hand side, the husband in Christian marriages doesn't always get it right, is what I'm saying. And we know that that is the truth. We know that's the case because look what Paul says makes someone potentially suitable to be an elder or a leader. It says in 1 Timothy 3, verse 4 and 5, he must manage his own household well, with all dignity. And for if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? So if that was one of the marks for someone that's got to be trying to get it right or getting it right more often than not, if that's one of the reasons as to why someone might be suitable to be an elder, it infers there's plenty that aren't getting it right because it was a test. If they're not doing this, then they're not suitable to lead God's household. Why, though, does God say it should be a particular way? Why should it be a particular way round in a marriage? Why shouldn't it be based purely on who has the best ability or just who wants to do it? Before we answer that question, I want husbands to look at that list on the right and see who Peter is comparing you to. Don't feel that you're someone more special in that relationship. The examples he gives is the evil, the people that are getting it wrong, and yet the people on the left are still meant to submit because people are watching. This is the reason why the Bible gives Ephesians 5 verse 32. Talking about marriage, it says this: this mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. This mystery is profound. And he goes on to talk about various things. He says in Ephesians 5 verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Ephesians 5 verse 24, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. And then Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Marriage, you see, is an illustration, or should I say it's meant to be an illustration of how the church should relate to Christ and how Christ relates to the church. It's meant to be a picture. The whole point of these examples that Peter gives is that it's a picture. People are watching. And when it comes to a marriage, we get the further explanation by Paul of what the picture is. It's a picture. An unbelieving husband or wife need to see the picture. Our children need to see the picture. Our families and friends, the world out there looking in, needs to see the picture that a marriage represents how Christ loves the church and how the church loves Christ. When you think of your marriage, what do you illustrate? Men, is it sacrificial love? If people looked at you, would they say sacrificial love, just like Jesus? Women, is it respect and allowing him to lead? Remember, we're being watched. God has placed order and structure. He delights in the differences between men and women. We are not all meant to be identical. It's very current, it's very our culture to say we are the same really. But we're not meant to be. We have a different part in that picture to illustrate. We have different strengths and we have different weaknesses. Our culture seeks to eradicate any taste, any smell, any sight of those differences so often. We're now progressing to the point where you can just pick your sex and change your mind tomorrow. You can self-identify. That's what it's becoming more and more popular. As male or female or whatever you want. And what is our biblical view on that? Do you have a biblical view on that? I've got a little video, it's only a couple of minutes long, by a man called Sam Albury. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's he's either a vicar or a minister at a church down in the south part of the UK. And he's written a lot of books on homosexuality and biblical view of that. And he's got something for us to say for 2 minutes on how we should understand, more than anyone else, the whole issue of transgender.
The message of Christianity is vital as we think about the whole transgender issue, and for many reasons, but two primarily. The first is that we can uniquely account for how it is that someone could end up feeling so at home in their own body. For people who experience gender dysphoria, people who feel as though their assigned biological sex is not the same as their own gender identity, actually, we can account for how someone could feel that way because we understand as Christians that the physical creation has been subjected to frustration. It's out of joint. It doesn't work as it should do. And that includes our bodies. Our bodies have been subjected to that same frustration. And so none of us has a straightforward relationship with our bodies. That includes health issues, that includes body image issues, and it would also include those who don't feel in some way that they belong in the body that they have. I think we can account for that in a unique way, given our understanding of creation and our bodies within that, which should mean, therefore, that Christians are naturally the most compassionate and understanding people there are when it comes to this issue. That should be the case. So I hope we can offer unique understanding and unique compassion. But more than that, we can offer a unique hope. We know that our bodies are broken in different ways. All of us experience some measure of bodily brokenness. But we know that the ultimate answer to that brokenness doesn't lie within our own bodies. It lies actually within the ultimate broken body of Jesus. That is the case for all of our bodily brokenness. The solution is in him and not in us. And so therefore the ultimate hope for those who are transgender is not going to be found in their own body and in what they can and can't do with it and all the procedures that are available today. The ultimate hope is in Jesus, because the ultimate dysphoria was when he who had no sin was made to be sin for us. That is the ultimate feeling of being in the wrong flesh. And it is in that we all have our ultimate hope, that in his ultimate brokenness, actually we can find the true solution to our own brokenness, the true hope of the gospel.
Let's look into some of the details of our passage. 1 Peter 3 verses 1 to 2 has these words. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Now, just like I was saying a couple of weeks ago about how God doesn't want us as an employee, to go and find the worst employer so that we can live out how to be a Christian in that situation. He doesn't encourage that. This also is not encouraging Christian women to marry men from other religions or no religion, which the Bible speaks about against in other places. And we're not meant to go ahead and do that just so that we can live lives for Christ and win them to Christ. That's not what it's talking about. It's not suggesting that we marry non-Christians so that our actions speak for Jesus. Instead, like I mentioned, it's addressing in particular an issue where probably was common at the time, it certainly happens today, where a wife becomes a Christian, but her husband still isn't. In that culture, that would have been seen as the ultimate betrayal of your husband. Really disrespectful, really going against your husband. And Peter is saying, in that situation, remain with them, don't seek a divorce. We see that Paul has similar advice in other parts of the Bible. Continue to show respect and submission to them, and your good, respectful, pure conduct will begin to win them for the Lord. Not your arguing or shouting, not your combativeness and disrespectfulness, but respectful, considerate, good attitude and pure conduct will paint a picture that will start to speak to their lives. It's interesting that just in the other two examples, there is still an order to this. In that, what I mean by that is the order is first and foremost, like it was in the other situations, that we are a slave of God first. So we see this in verse 2. When they see your pure, i.e. your not sinful conduct. Verse 4 refers to the hidden person of the heart, which in God's sight is very precious. And verse 6 refers to if you do good. So it's not saying that, wives, it doesn't matter what you do now, it doesn't matter if your husband tells you to sin, just go and do it. It's not saying that. Just in the same way that Peter wasn't saying you should obey a law that says, well, in our example, we said, well, you can't tell people about Jesus. Yes, we're to obey the laws of the land, but when it comes to something like that, we're a slave of God first. And this is talking about that same situation. Because we need in these relationships to be modelling Christ and the church. And modelling Christ and the church isn't following someone to sin. It's not the right picture. How does this actually... One of the things that Nicola often challenges me with when I'm preaching is saying, make sure you make it really relevant. Give me an example. So how does this work practically in a marriage? Well, I actually think that most times this shouldn't be an issue at all. Because most times, certainly from our experience, in most of life, it's not about submission and not submitting. It's about working together and making decisions together and working as a helper to each other to fulfill what God has for us together in most situations. But what it does say is that if there is a disagreement, if there is a point that can't be resolved, then it's me that gets the blame and she's meant to follow me. That's what it says. And that cuts against a lot of our society today. We live in a topsy-turvey world. Just going to read verses 3 and 4 to you as well. as verses, and I want us to talk about verses 1 to 2 and 3 and 4. 3 and 4 says, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." When we read those verses and we think of verses 1 and 2 as well, we see that we live in a world that is completely the opposite to what Peter says here. One of them has got it wrong. Either our society's got it wrong, or the Bible's got it wrong. And it's interesting that the pressure on our society is to do the opposite in both situations. Our mainstream media and social media push the message that it is always demeaning to submit to a man. Every year, the message gets stronger and stronger. 27 years ago, when Nicola and I got married, we were preparing and looking at what vows we were going to say. And it was just around the time when the new wording had come out for marriage vows. It was in 1980, these words came out, and I think it was 82 when we got married. The vicar gave us these words: "I, Nicola or Matthew, take you," the opposite other one, "to be my wife or husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part, according to the God's holy law, and this is my solemn vow." But they were different words, the words we were looking for. So we requested to have the old words, which goes like this: "I, Nicola Zoe Bell, take you, Matthew Paul Rich, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey till death us do part, according to God's holy law, and this is my solemn vow." So we went through it with the vicar, and he said he was happy to do it. But the big joke is that when it came to it, he completely forgot. Okay? And so from then onwards, well, for a few years anyway, Nicola would say to me, "I never promised to do it." But I don't love Nicola because there was a promise I made to do it. I love her because I love her. Which means that even when I don't feel like doing something, I should still do it. And vice versa for Nicola. It's not about what promise she made. It's about her relationship with God and whether she wants to follow culture or the Bible. And often the picture becomes blurred of the picture between Christ and the church in our life. But our desire is that it would be clear. Now, our culture, I realise, rejects the whole idea of a wife submitting to a husband because of all the misuse and abuse. And bad it is. Don't get me wrong. It is often very, very bad. And I'm not condoning or encouraging that in any way. Remember, we talked about how there are laws of the land and we're meant to submit to the laws of the land. And there are laws against abuse. I'm not condoning abuse. There are laws in the Bible, there are instructions in the Bible about submitting to God first. I'm not condoning abuse. But even in non-abusive relationships, our culture still says that it's wrong because it's linked to value and worth. But the Bible doesn't teach that. It's interesting that our culture also turns verses 3 and 4 on their head as well. Because no matter what people say, we in our culture today still raise on a pedestal the significance and worth and value of outward appearance. We might say we don't, but you just have to look in any magazine, any TV program. Anything says the other is more true. We promote outward looks. We've turned what Peter here, what God says, completely on its head in both of those situations. Peter is saying, wives who have converted to Christianity, your husband is upset with you for doing this. Don't focus your efforts to win him back on what you look on the outside, but on your inward beauty. With the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Not by being combative, not by trying to always argue and persuade, not by doing your hair and putting on the bling. Peter isn't saying those things are bad, but don't put your focus there. It doesn't say that God hates beautiful things, people that have done their hair, that have made it, put on some jewelry. It doesn't actually teach in this passage here that God hates that, but it does say how much more precious in God's sight is inward beauty. Another thing that's really important for us to pick up is that whenever the Bible talks about husbands and wives and relationships and how it's going to work, there are two things it never says. It never says that we are to wait until the other person gets better before we do our bit. It never says, when my wife learns to submit, then I'll be sacrificial. It never says, when my husband is sacrificial, then I will let him lead. It doesn't say those things. The example we have here is of someone that didn't know what the picture should even look like. But it said the wife was meant to know and meant to represent that relationship between Christ and the church. The second thing is the instruction is always to you. Okay? It never says anywhere in the Bible, husbands, make your wives submit. Wives, make your husband lead. It doesn't say that. It says the instruction is to you because it's about you and your relationship with God. It's about you choosing for a greater purpose and having self-control, whichever side of that situation. Now, I don't want the husbands to think that they're getting away with this, because 1 Peter 3 verse 7 then goes on to talk to husbands. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honour to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. I just want to stop and say, in those days, this would have been radical. You might not think it sounds very radical today, but in a culture where a wife was a little bit more than an object that you owned, this is radical stuff. But even in our society, we have a lot to learn from these words. The first one that it says, live with your wives. Now you might think that's obvious, but it's possible to be present and not living with someone. It's possible to be there in the same room and not actually live with them. Are you together enough? Are you really present when you are there with your wife? Not just living under the same roof, but actually being there together. The second one is, it says, live with your wives in an understanding way. Do you know what helps your wife and what hinders her? What worries her and what causes her to flourish? Do you understand her? Have you made effort to understand her? Have you put thought and effort in? Do you live sacrificially for her? In that example, when I started to talk a bit more practically about it, I think that certainly most Christian ladies would have less of an issue in submitting to a husband if they really were living sacrificially for her. Because it changes the game. Husbands, do you live sacrificially for her? Is everything you do about her best, her benefit, to help her? The third thing says showing honour to the woman as the weaker vessel. Now this meaning weaker vessel is not talking about spiritually weaker or morally weaker. It's purely talking about physically weaker. No matter what people say, we aren't all the same. And it comes up from time to time. It's in the news at the moment, isn't it? Because of athletes, transgender athletes. Can they compete? Can men who have become women compete in women's races? Some people have accused them of cheating. And that hit the headlines, because how could you say that to someone? when they're really a woman. And it's causing all this stir, and they haven't quite decided. They keep coming up with ideas, but they haven't worked it out yet. It would be interesting to see what happens at the next Olympics. Will we have women who are men, men who are women, competing with other people? The Bible says that we are different, and here it talks about the weaker vessel. Now you have to remember that in this time particularly, and you might say it's the same in my house, but in this time particularly, the women were only a little bit more than a domestic slave in many ways, because they were having to do everything, and it was all extremely physical and hard work. They didn't have the modern things that we have today, like washing machines and I don't know what else, but whatever these things that I would really miss if I was living in those days. It was hard. And Peter is saying, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. It's not demeaning or condescending to say, do you give value and respect, help, protection, dare I say it, chivalry? Are we allowed to say that these days and do that? Do we give honor to our wives? Do we share the load of the hard work? And fourthly, it says they are heirs. Heirs with you of the grace of life. The message is that your wife is of equal spiritual significance as the husband. Again, this would have been radical at the time. The things that they were saying would have been a real shock. But we need to realize that, just like I showed you at the beginning, submission and not submitting is not about worth. It's not about importance. It's not about significance. It's about just doing something that might be uncomfortable for the greater picture of what God wants to show. It's not about worth. Husbands and wives, men and women are of the same value spiritually to God in every way. And the Bible is clear about that. And men, if you haven't got the message, Peter then drums it home even more and says the way you treat your wife effectively, he's saying it affects your closeness to God. The closeness of your walk with God is affected by how you treat your wife. He actually uses the words here that it affects your prayers. The illustration is that it affects your relationship because your prayers are affected by your relationship with God. Now, within context, this might be talking about primarily about the salvation of a non-Christian wife. Some people talk about that. But the point is that it affects our prayers. Now, I said at the beginning that this is a lot about husbands and wives, and it's really countercultural. And it might have brought up lots of questions for you, and I'm very happy to talk about them. Or you can ask Nicola, and she'll tell you how I get it wrong or get it right. But we're happy to talk about it. We don't get it right. Nobody gets that picture right. But it's about what we're aiming for. What are we aiming to show in our relationship? What picture are we seeking to paint? And like I said at the beginning, there's a lot about husbands and wives, but I've picked out two things in particular that are relevant across the board. If you miss them, I'm just going to highlight them. And they are this. For all women, and maybe in our society to men too, this is the question. How much time and effort do you spend on improving your outward beauty in comparison to the time you put in to your inward beauty? Which do you really think is more important? I know what God says. God says that the inward person is precious to him. For men, and maybe women too, do your thoughts and attitudes demonstrate proper honour towards women? Proper respect, proper understanding. I'm not just talking about to your wife, I'm talking about across the board. Do your thoughts and attitudes demonstrate proper honour to women? Do you view them in the right way? And vice versa, if you've been hurt by a man, does that affect how you see men in general? I know I talk to people online, and some people say to me, I hate all men because someone did this to me. And then someone did this. We need to be careful. We have hurts, we carry burdens and hurts, but we also still need to be God-honouring in our thoughts and our attitudes. So that's the challenge for today. Really countercultural stuff, really challenging stuff for all of us. I might have painted a picture that I get it all right. Please forgive me if I have done, because that is not the message I'm trying to say. I'm in the same game, the same battle of trying my best to paint the picture that God wants painted to those that know me.